If you're into metal culture, old record stores, tape trading, and the weird ways people used to discover music before the internet, that's basically what this channel is about. So if that's your thing, welcome to Jake Whirled. This is the Jake Whirled Podcast. Every episode we talk about music culture, collecting, and the stuff that existed before algorithms started deciding what everyone listens to. So when we were about 13 or 14 years old, there was a period of time when sleepovers were all about one thing: staying up late and watching Headbangers Ball. Yeah, Headbangers Ball. Now, this was right around the time we were crossing into heavier music. We knew the bigger stuff: Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Guns N' Roses was starting to pop, bands like that. And honestly, even stuff like the Beastie Boys and Anthrax helped bridge the gap into this heavier music. Anthrax's I'm the Man, sounding a lot like the Beastie Boys, made it a familiar crossover when you're watching Headbangers Ball and heavier music was on the menu. But Headbangers Ball is when things got interesting, because the show had this progression to it. Earlier in the night you get the bigger bands, the stuff everyone already knew. But the later it got, the weirder and the deeper the show got. It was kind of like how Saturday Night Live used to be in the 90s. The deeper in the night you went, the stranger the sketches got. Headbangers Ball had the same energy. The real deep cuts started coming out as the night wore on, into the second and third hours. And that's where the challenges started. Yeah, we couldn't just watch Headbangers Ball. We had to add to the chaos, because the hairspray, the fire, the screaming, and that's before the music started, that wasn't enough. You had to pick a band, okay? You weren't allowed to pick Metallica. You weren't allowed to pick Slayer. You had to go to the deep end of the pool. Something you've never heard before. Something no one in the room had heard before. So suddenly you're discovering bands like Nuclear Assault, DRI, Overkill, MOD, SOD, stuff that wasn't on the radio, wasn't in the mainstream, nothing even like that. And remember, this was the late 80s, early 90s. Even the heavy stuff back then, by today's standards, it sounds tame. It might, to some. But when you were hearing it for the first time at 14, it was mind-blowing. You know, some of them worked out and some of them didn't. Some of them were good and some of them were not good. In fact, I think there was a lot of bad ones. You'd hear something for the first time and immediately think, okay, this is mine. You know, when something clicked, then you owned it. The rest just went into the tape collection. And the crazy thing about all of it is once you picked the band, you still had to figure out where the hell you were going to get this music from. Once we picked bands on Headbangers Ball, we had to find the music. That was really the challenge. And that's where the local record stores came in. So after you discovered music on Headbangers Ball, the next part of the challenge was figuring out where to actually find it. And that's where the local record stores came in. Back then, record stores, music stores, tape stores, CD stores, whatever you want to call it, music stores, they were like discovery hubs. You'd walk in and immediately get hit with all of it at once. Metal, hardcore, thrash, skate stuff, even punk, alternative, whatever's happening at the time. Now, it depends on the store. Don't get me wrong. There are different stores for different vibes, you know? There's the tie-dye stores. They have a little dankier, Grateful Dead folk vibe, you know? There's hip-hop stores and, you know, some in different neighborhoods. So it all depends on your perspective. The point being that there was more than just music happening here. And a lot of time it might be connected to the owner. So the store that we went to in our town happened to perfectly align. When you walked in, there were glass cases that were filled with back patches and jean jacket patches and decals, collectibles. There were imported cassettes, imported CDs later on. There were T-shirts and all kinds of different, band memorabilia and swag that you wouldn't find anywhere else. And it was all metal in this particular store. So when we would go to the mall, we'd have to find that one little tiny corner where there might be a little bit of hard rock and heavy metal. This place was the opposite. It was mostly metal. It was actually probably more, a mix, but heavily slanted toward the metal slot. So that's where we found a lot of our music. And, depending on the store that you went to, that a lot of times influenced what, where your musical taste ended up going. So the experience, there was a lot of underground, unusual bands, Domino Effect. You would find a band on Headbangers Ball and you'd be going through the racks, and then you would buy another album just because it was cheap or it had a nice cover or some combination of the two, or it had some profanity or some obscenity that made you laugh. Whatever it was. And that's where the real digging happened, because you weren't just buying something you already knew, you were hunting. And these bootlegs, I remember clearly the Donington Castle Metallica, having that bootleg before I really liked Metallica. It took me a little while, as a teenager. I'm talking, I don't know, 6 months. It wasn't an immediate thing. That's a story for a later date. But I had that bootleg that was passed on to me, or can't even say for sure where it came from, but that's kind of how things went back then. But especially for the big bands, you'd see different versions of the same shows, different recordings, all circulating. A lot of it was European, at least the stuff that I would run across, that we would see. It wasn't clean or organized. It was messy. Some of it was hand scrawled. A lot of it was magic marker type stuff on, BASF or, whatever, your common run-of-the-mill cassette tapes. Usually higher quality ones. And they were charging a decent amount of money for those, too. The magic of it was, honestly, what made it feel different. You walk in and you knew what you were getting, to some degree. You knew you could find it. You might go in looking for one thing and walk out with something else completely different. And that wasn't always bad. Sometimes it was better. Something you'd never heard of before. And that's how half of my music collection started. And once you started finding weird stuff in the record stores, that's when you'd realize that there's a whole nother layer to it. And there's many layers. Bootlegs, tape trading, stuff getting passed around outside the system. And that's where it gets even deeper. And once you get past record stores, you start realizing something. There's a whole other system underneath all of it. Because not everything was officially released. A lot of it was circulating outside of the normal channels. Bootlegs, tape trades, copies of recordings that weren't really meant to exist in a commercial way. I mean, some of them you couldn't even tell if they were real or not. Later on, I remember years later, LimeWire, a lot of these type of things would exist there. Some of them were legitimate, some of them were not. it wasn't local either. This was global. This trading of bootlegs. People would literally mail tapes to each other. Someone in one place records a show. They legally, I guess, I don't know how that works, but they bring in a recording device to a show, and it gets copied again and again, and every copy slightly changes it, makes it a little bit more, put some patina on it, as they say. It degrades, it shifts, but it also spreads. Sometimes things get added to it, things that are funny, things that are not. These were not just straight albums either. You'd get live shows, rare recordings, weird versions of songs you'd never heard anywhere else. Sometimes better than the official in their own way. A lot of times when bands would release live albums during this time, they weren't live albums. Not to say, a band can have an off night here or there or whatever. That's not even the issue. It's just a shitty recording is a shitty recording, and even a good band doesn't sound good on a bad recording. Try it one of these days. YouTube's full of them, these types of recordings. But anyways, it was completely chaotic, but always interesting. The crazy part is you had to wait for it. You couldn't just click it, You'd send something out, and then maybe weeks later something else would show up in your mailbox and that kind of thing. I was never part of that end of it. You'd talk to these guys, the guy that ran the store, the guys behind the counter, and they tell you how all that went down and whatever. I never got that deep into it, honestly. I just bought it overpriced, overpaid for it. But that was how you avoided having to get into the all the piracy side of it, I suppose. So yeah, but how it all kind of connects back is you'd hear this music on Headbangers Ball, and then you were finding it in your local record store. It wasn't separate systems. It was all the same underground flow of music moving all around in different ways. It wasn't an accident that music was being played somewhere on MTV and other places, other outlets, and then it was available here in this town. And then on top of all of that, there were the shortcuts. The ways people tried to build massive collections without even leaving the house. Those were the mail order clubs, catalog systems, all of that. Columbia House, BMG. And that's where it gets funny. Kind of. So, when you look back at all of this, the weird thing is how human the whole system was. Nothing was automated. There were no algorithms deciding what you should hear next. The difference was the music discovery back then depended on people. Sometimes the employees at the stores, tape traders, the local radio stations, the college radio stations, the late night music shows, the Headbangers Ball, the guests on Saturday Night Live sometimes, or the guests on the local radio shows. Someone had to show you something, or you had to go find it yourself. The effort, and that effort was part of the experience. You didn't just hear a band for the first time. You remembered where you heard it. Was it at a sleepover, watching Headbangers Ball, or, buried in a record store rack? Was it some weird bootleg someone passed around? Every band has a story attached to it. The modern comparison, I guess, now is that music is everywhere. You can hear anything instantly. But something about that process, the digging, the waiting, the randomness, that's kind of gone. And honestly, that same feeling still pops up sometimes, just in a different place. These days it happens when you're digging through thrift stores, flea markets, random piles of old media. Maybe somebody's TikTok or YouTube channel, and you never know what you're going to find. But for now, that's today's episode. And if you grew up discovering music before the internet, you probably remember exactly what this felt like. Before we wrap this up, let's get into the thrift pile. This is where I talk about whatever weird stuff I found digging around thrift stores this week. Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's movies, sometimes it's video games, or random pop culture junk. But it's the same feeling as digging through the used bin at the old tape store. You never know what you're going to find. So today's thrift pile was actually pretty good. I found Clue on VHS. That's a score. The Last Boy Scout. Revenge of the Nerds. Batman and Robin. And Romeo Must Die. A couple other random things too. Dr. Seuss Lunchbox. Some graphic novels, and just a classic thrift pile. But the one I'm actually going to talk about next episode is The Last Boy Scout, because that movie is basically a perfect early 90s crossover moment. You've got Bruce Willis bringing that burned out hard rock action movie energy, and Damon Wayans brings a completely different hip hop attitude. And the whole thing is wrapped around pro football and the early 90s vibe. So next episode, we'll break that one down a little bit. Anyway, that's today's episode. If you grew up discovering music before the internet, you probably remember exactly what this felt like. This is Jake Whirled.